So, welcome to today's webinar from the International Alliance of ALS M&D Associations, an update from our Scientific Advisory Council. For this webinar, we have captions available in multiple languages. If you are joining us live on Zoom, please check the chat box as I will be adding the instructions shortly, or scan the QR code on screen if you have another device available. And if you're watching the recording in our YouTube channel, you will find the instructions in the video description on how to activate the subtitles. Hopefully you can get, there we go. Para este seminario web tenemos subtítulos en español disponible. Si se unen a nosotros en vivo vía Zoom, verifiquen en la casilla del chat, ya que estaré agregando las instrucciones en un momento, o pueden acceder a la traducción por medio del código QR en pantalla usando otro dispositivo. Y si están viendo la grabación en nuestro canal de YouTube, encontrarán las instrucciones en la descripción del video sobre cómo activar los subtítulos. For this webinar, we are using automated captions. Please bear in mind that this kind of translation is not perfect and many variables can affect accuracy and errors are possible. However, even if a few words are incorrect, you should still be able to get the meaning in context. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jessica Mabe, Programs Coordinator for the International Alliance, and I am joined today by members of the Alliance's Scientific Advisory Council. Before we start, I want to highlight our Advisory Council as a whole. They are a fantastic group of experts that work with the Alliance throughout the year to provide us with evidence-based information that we can then share with the public and our member associations. The chair of the council is Dr. Kuldip Dave, Vice President of Research at the ALS Association, and who will be moderating our webinar today. In the screen, you can see the full council, and unfortunately, due to time, I can't go through their incredible profiles, but you can learn more about them on the Alliance website. There we go. I will let the panel introduce themselves shortly. Now, some final instructions. First, you can see we've got a fantastic geographical global panel. Now, any questions you have for our panel, please write them in the Zoom Q&A box. I also want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who pre-submitted their questions. There is a lot to cover, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as we can in the time we have. I will now turn it over to Dr. Kuldip Dave, our moderator for today.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you everybody for joining. The SAC likes to provide an update twice a year, and this is our first update this year. I'll have the panel introduce themselves, and then we'll go into some of the topics that we're really passionate about, that we're thinking about, that's in front of our minds. And then after that, we'll get into some more discussions and questions at the end. Thank you again for joining. And with that, I will go to each of our SAC members and ask them to introduce themselves. And we'll start with Dr. Notina Sharizala first. Notina.
Hi, thanks, Kuldip. Hi, everyone. I'm Notina Sharizala. I'm based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And I'm here. I'm a neurologist with a special interest in ALS. I'm also the current lead for the Pan-Asian Consortium for Treatment and Research in ALS, which is PACTELS.
Thank you. Dr. Nadia Sethi.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nadia Sethi. I lost my husband to a fast-progressing form of ALS in 2020. I'm also the CEO and co-founder of North Star ALS. We're built to connect the ALS community with research in different ways. Pleasure to be here today.
Thank you, Nadia. Dr. Gethin Thomas.
Hi, Giffen Thomas. I'm based in Australia and I'm currently the acting scientific director for the Alliance, as well as working with FIGHT-MND to support the Global MND Research Roundtable.
Great. Dr. Piera Pesinelli.
Yes, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Piera Pasinelli. I'm a neuroscientist. I've been working on ALS, doing ALS research for the past 30 years. I'm a professor of neuroscience at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, and I'm the founder and director of the Weinberg ALS Center, which is a clinical and research integrated program.
Thank you, Piera. And Dr. Jinsy Andrews.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jinsey Andrews. I'm a professor at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. I'm the director of the ALS Center there in New York City. We're having our heyday here in New York with the FIFA World Cup and the basketball team winning. I also am the the medical director of clinical trials at the Department of Neurology there at NYU. I'm also the chair of the Network of Excellence for ALS, also known as NEALS. And I have the privilege of working with the International Alliance and the Science Advisory Committee. So pleasure to be here.
All right. Thank you all for joining. So what I thought we would do first is maybe come to each of you. You are all in your various, jobs and what you do daily. There are things that are on top of your mind, things that you are thinking about that you would like to educate the community on. And so I'll go to each of you, maybe spend 4 minutes on this topic, on sort of what's in front of your mind, how you're seeing it, how do you see it, now, and how do you see it perhaps changing in the future. And so with that, we'll go to Notina first. And Notina, what's on top of your mind right now?
Um, well, being here, obviously, on the SAC. Well, I guess, just a bit of a background. So I've been privileged in that, I've had an opportunity working in a setting like the UK, which is a higher income country, and then coming back to Malaysia about 17 years ago. Is certainly a very different perspective in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, in terms of what's happening in the ALS field. Um, and I'm talking about coming at this from a perspective of ALS in underrepresented settings, because my experience when I was when I was doing the ALS clinic in the UK is very, very different to what I experience in Kuala Lumpur. Certainly, to start with, the awareness is not great to begin with. So it was really starting from scratch, establishing, a disease awareness, and then establishing multidisciplinary care clinics, establishing disease registry, establishing international standards approach to how you diagnose. And then we come to accessibility in terms of treatments. So where we are when it comes to research, I think to start with, yes, it takes a long time, but you have to actually do all of that first in all the different, in the many, many areas where there is limited resource, where we see this underrepresentation when you look at research. And I think it's wonderful that, we're having this sort of forum, and certainly the Alliance has been crucial in trying to bring people together so that, we can have a more global perspective. And I guess that's where I'm coming from. And, Gethin is going to talk about some of the collaboration that is underway to try and shine a spotlight in terms of doing research. And we can certainly talk about it later in terms of what is available and what's not available. But I can tell you that there is a lot not available, but it's not that there aren't people who have the capacity to do research. It's just that the resource and is just not there. And I think we need the global community to come together. And that could be, a hub and spoke model that could just really making sure that wherever you're doing research, you're always including the underrepresented countries in that research in a broader spectrum. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, Tina, thank you. I think we all here agree that, this is ALS-MND is such a complicated and complex disease, and it's going to take the whole world to come together. And I think you're really speaking to a very passionate topic. Thank you. Jinsey, I'll come next to you. What's sort of on top of your mind right now in just maybe next 3 or 4 minutes?
Yeah, I think kind of going on what Nortina and what we're all going to kind of say is, I really, my background is clinical trials and clinical research, and on the forefront of my mind is the clinical trial pipeline and making sure that the preliminary signals that we see in early phase clinical trials, despite, the conversations in the community and whether we think it works or not. Really confirming those signals are really important in a phase 3 clinical trial. And that's really important for us as a community to understand that that's how we determine efficacy. Of course, in clinical development, all over the world, we want to make sure that we do it as efficiently as possible because people living with ALS don't have time, but we really need it. We really need the efficacy data or any potential benefits of a drug to be seen in a controlled clinical trial. There are ways, and of course, I work on programs that use parallel studies or using early data and biomarkers to try to see if we can gain efficiency. But at the end of the day, we have to have that phase 3 trial, whether it's under a conditional approval or accelerated approval or under full approval pathway. Now, a lot of people are excited about our pipeline now. And I've seen a lot of conversations about the pipeline, but just to be clear, the global pipeline for ALS is really heavy on the phase 1, phase 2 side. And a lot of new and exciting science live there and will blossom from there. The items or the investigational products that are in late phase clinical development now, remember, it takes drugs about to go from phase 1 to phase 3, it takes 6 to 10 years. So some of the science is from like 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And what we knew then, and we have exploded in terms of our knowledge of clinical trial innovation biomarkers since that time. But in late phase clinical trial, just to be clear, we have a few compounds that are being evaluated. The first is masitinib. This is a tyrosine kinase inhibitor, and it's currently enrolling its phase 3 to confirm some signals from earlier phase studies. And so we're waiting to see what that will play out. We also have another drug called ibutylast. Sometimes people will search it and see MN166. This is a phosphodiesterase inhibitor. It is fully enrolled, and they did get some critical regulatory advice in the US recently about a potential pathway forward if it shows a positive benefit in people living with ALS. So we're waiting that. And one of the special things about that program is that it has a concurrent expanded access program that may provide additional data. So that's one of those innovative ways to think about getting as much data as possible to move efficiently forward. The other compounds in late phase, so they're also small molecules. They include pridopidine, which is a sigma-1 receptor agonist. And this also is a drug that was developed through the Healy platform trial, and that's currently enrolling. And then there's 2 other products that are planned to initiate phase 3. One is CNM-AU8. This is a product that has gone through also the Healy platform trial and has graduated to a phase 3. It also, pridopidine and CNM-AU8, has concurrent expanded access programs that will provide supportive data to the control data in clinical trials. And last is Prime C, which is a combination of ciprofloxacin and Celebrex that is thought to be neuroprotective. There's preliminary signals in phase 2. It will require a phase 3. And I think there's a lot of enthusiasm in the community, and we're hoping that there's a good push to get these phase 3s off the ground so that we can really learn the efficacy. When it comes to T cells and stem cells, that's the number one question I get as a clinician from people. We've got 3 programs that are evaluating T cells that I'm aware of. One is RAPA 501 from RAPA Therapeutics. They're doing a phase 2 study, and they also have a concurrent EAP. We have Koya Therapeutics that is currently enrolling for their product that enhances T regulatory cell function. And then earlier phase is Cellenkos. Cellenkos has what they call allogenic, or they derive T cells not from your own body. And they're also developing and moving into a phase 2 here in the United States. And then in terms of stem cells, of course, everybody knows the Brainstorm story. They have a planned phase 3 and hoping that they can actually push that study off the ground so we can get a definitive answer in a controlled setting of the preliminary signals that we saw in prior studies. So that's kind of the late phase clinical trial landscape, just to start the conversation.
Thank you, Jinsy. This is really what patients want to know, people with ALS, they want to know what is in the pipeline and what is sort of on the horizon. And I think it's really great to have that list of compounds or drugs that you listed. Pierre, I'll come to you next. Given what Jinsy just said about clinical development, can't really have clinical development without preclinical work that is the foundation for that clinical trial. And so I know that this is something that you wanted to discuss. And so, Pierre,
Yes, and following what Ginty just said, and in particular what Nortina just said, right? We really have in this complex and heterogeneous disease, right? So, and not only we have to work globally together and really raise awareness and funding for ALS research globally, and share information about the early phase and late phase trials, but also bring immediately the preclinical research at the forefront and having that conversation between the clinical and the preclinical research all the time. And this really, and that's why originally I mentioned our center, which is a clinical research integrated program, because in particular in the past 10 years, this is really what has been on my mind, how we can better connect preclinical and clinical research. I think for many years we thought about the ALS research as a pipeline, right? We go from discovery to preclinical development to clinical trials, different phases and therapy. But increasingly, I think the model is really outdated because we know that the disease is so heterogeneous. So rather than being a sequence, I really think, or a stepwise approach, the process has to be. So to be more efficient and to learn faster has to be a continuous feedback loop. So the patients inform the science, and therefore we really need to involve the patients also in how we shape the translational preclinical research. Science informed clinical trials. The clinical trials, even those that fail, and I don't believe in any failed clinical trial because we learn also from unsuccessful trials, teach us a new biology, and that biology goes back to the laboratory, and the cycle has to start again. So why this matter now? If you think about 20 years ago or 30 years ago when I started, one of our biggest challenges was identifying therapeutic targets using the tools that we had at that point, basically recreating disease in animal models, using only the one gene that we knew that was SOD1. Now, animal models are still very valid, but today I think we have much more. Today we have genetics, we have more genetics, we have patient-derived cells that are not as good as studying the spinal cord and the brain of the living patients, but it is as good as it gets. With stem cell technology, we can really study even the mini brain now, but also the motor neurons with the specific molecular composition of the particular patients or group of patients. We are beginning to focus on the identification of biomarkers, as Ginzy just said. We have biobanks, we have multi-omics approaches, we have natural history studies that are global at this point, and we have AI and more sophisticated analysis tools that can really help us dissect the heterogeneity of the disease at the molecular level more efficiently. And so we have the tools to identify and eventually test potential therapeutic targets faster than before. The challenge now, I think, is no longer and simply finding targets. The challenge is determining which targets truly matter, and this is where the preclinical research is fundamental, which are sufficiently validated, and there is where we have to talk with the clinician, which patients are most likely to benefit. Perhaps now is the time to really, based on the identification of group-specific targets, to really stratify patients, to enroll them in clinical trial in a more targeted and tailored ways, and when should intervention occur? This question cannot be answered, I think, by laboratory scientists like me alone, by clinician alone, or by industry alone. And this is also very, very important. Industry oftentimes comes late with the target that they have identified without really coming early to all of us, the ALS community, to really ask us whether the target matter and how we should really design a targeted or a better informed clinical trials. So I think the main message is really that the future, I think, of ALS research, which is not the future, is really the present, is not moving simply from discovery to bench, from bench to bedside, but really creating a continuous learning system where information flows in both directions. And I think that webinars like these, panels like this, are really very useful because we can really talk to one another and see and discuss what challenges do I face in a translational laboratories, and what are the challenges that Nortina, clinicians like Nortina and Ginzi face, and how we can really connect early on with that.
Yeah, thank you, Pierre. I think when you mentioned the feedback loop between preclinical and clinical, I think better biology, better biomarkers, I think what you're saying is we don't need just more trials or faster trials. We want better trials. And I think what you're saying would go to that. So thank you, Pierre. That was great. Pierre, you mentioned something about, we can't do this alone. It's not just lab scientists, it's not just clinicians, it's not just industry. Gethin, I'd like to come to you on that. It is going to take a village. It's going to take, people to come together and collaborate. And I know that you have some views and perspectives on that. So Gethin, to you.
Thank you, Corey. Yeah, so I think as both Nortina has alluded to as well, that in my role both in the Alliance and working with FIDE-MD and the Round Table, collaboration has been a real sort of key interest of ours and a focus. So I think we all know that researchers like to collaborate, and probably the best research we see is collaborative research. But I think sometimes researchers tend to collaborate with the people they know or within their region or within their country. And I think that the real challenge for us is to how do we get to the collaborators to all collaborate together to create an umbrella that really brings these the whole global research community together in specific areas. I think in genetics, this has been done reasonably well. Project Mine, certainly in ALS MND genetics, has done a great job in genetics. I think across the board has been ahead of the game in sort of global collaborations. Perhaps it's a little easier for them to share data and samples as well, so that's made it easier. And Project Mine are certainly ahead of the game. But there's obviously other areas. We've got lots of big data these days. We've got biobanks all around the world. We have biomarker studies. We have natural history studies, but they're all run usually often in a single country or a single region like North America or in Europe. And even though the people running these studies all know each other across the world, there's often barriers, either financial, regulatory, to bring this together. So certainly it's a key interest of the Alliance and through the FIDE-MD Roundtable to work out ways we can act as perhaps neutral brokers to try and get everyone together, identify what you can call minimum data sets. Sometimes these are all these data sets are built on like databases that don't really talk very well to each other. So how can we pull the data out of these databases so that we can pull it all together and really increase the power of our studies? How can we incorporate people from underrepresented regions, like Nortina was saying? How do we bring data to make these studies truly global? There's many examples in other disease areas where either rare genetic forms of a disease or therapies have been found in regions where not in North America, not in Europe, and this could well be the same in ALS MND. That the cliche, we don't know what we don't know. So how do we find this knowledge out? So this is what I'm very interested in doing. How can we bring people together to really make sure that we do work together? And if you're starting a new study, how can you actually consider how we can talk to other people during that study? How can our data integrate? What do we need to do? Can we use someone else's framework that's already there? Do we need to reinvent the wheel every time, which unfortunately happens? And we have these huge studies going on, Target ALS, all ALS in the US, Answer ALS in Europe. So we need to make sure that these studies can all talk to each other and we don't waste resources, which perhaps sometimes we have too much duplication, and we need to make sure we have synergy.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Gethin. And I always like to say collaboration is important, but coordination is even more important. And so I think thank you for driving home that point. Nadia, I'll come to you. Both Piera and Jinsey talked about the pipeline and going from preclinical to clinical, and but there is that middle stage where the first in human studies, early trials read out. They're generally small. They're generally looking at safety and tox, but sometimes they create a lot of noise. How do you kind of channel out what the hope is versus what the hype is in that earlier stage clinical trial? I know you're really passionate about this. If you could say a few words about that, that would be great.
Absolutely. I'm loving all of the conversations today, and I think I'm going to be drawing on all of the conversations that we've had already for this. The hope versus hype is a really complex thing. When we're going through ALS, many of us are. I remember I used to say we're living on hope, and we definitely don't want to take that away from people, but we want context for things. We want to understand what the reality is, and we want people to be able to make informed decisions. And I know even in my house, it was really difficult. We would see news articles or press releases, and it gets to you. It's very hard to know. I remember my husband telling me at one point, the cure is going to come right after I pass away. And those are really hard words to hear. And so I think it's really important for us to take the science and give it some context so that people can understand what it means for them today. No matter, it's important to understand that early stage research is still early. And we also want to spend our time when we're going through ALS in a meaningful way. And we don't, I mean, people can spend their time how they choose, but it's important to not lose sight of what matters. And so if we spend a lot of our time wishing for things rather than focusing on what we can do today, we may miss out on important, precious time with our families and things like that. So really, my hope lies in people making informed decisions, and in preserving our energy and our time for the things that matter. Some of the things to consider with those early phase trials, especially, so the Alliance put out a great note last year for sponsors to see, to kind of tell the sponsors, hey, you need to communicate responsibly. These are things that you should think about. You should incorporate the community into, when you're putting out press releases, have the community members review that, make sure you're unblinding in a reasonable amount of time, make sure that, you're letting people know what is the next path, what has to come next to get this drug advanced. So we have a note from the Alliance letting sponsors know that side. On our side, on the people living with ALS and caregivers, the ALS community more broadly, we can also be proactive in thinking about hope versus hype. And so one of the big things, we already touched on this a little bit today, is, can we match the trial size with the messaging that's being delivered? If we have a very short, small trial with 10 people in 3 months versus a phase 3 trial that Dr. Andrews talked about, that's 200 people for a year, those trials are answering very different questions potentially. Early phase trials are really designed to understand where the drug is going in your body, to maybe some biomarker engagement. Is the drug hitting a specific target that it's supposed to? Is the drug safe? If it's a brand new drug, we really need to, we don't know what's going to happen when it goes goes into humans. So those are basic questions that those early phase trials are supposed to answer, and they're not necessarily designed to answer whether the drug is truly working. So why are sponsors, maybe a little optimistic in their messaging? They are also, the sponsors are out looking for what they need. They're looking for funding. That doesn't make that messaging okay, but I think we need to really come at when we're reading those press releases or those news stories, if we as a community are proactive in understanding why those things might be a little bit over optimistic, we'll be better armed to process that information. It's really important to look for in press releases what's missing. And it's very hard to know what's missing at times. But we don't, I always ask, what do we win? And so if we're not looking for those hard questions, we're not looking for those things that are missing, then we may be missing out on what the reality is. And at the end of the day, this also goes back to how we spend our time. Do we want to be taking drugs that are not necessarily helping us? That also takes time, effort, all of those things out of our day. So it's really critical to have some context for those things. It's a great thing to have a conversation with your doctor about. We also live in a world where information, travels fast and is readily available. And so to always ask, what's missing from this? What are the issues with this? And that's not necessarily to be negative, but it's to identify where the reality is. So yeah, hopefully I covered that.
No, that was great. And maybe I'll open it up here to the rest of the panel. I think, Nadia, your point about, what you read in a press release is a perspective of the company, wanting to get the news out. That's not the full story. And so I think, Nadia's point that, look to the Alliance, for example, and the Scientific Advisory Committee, look to other organizations that can provide you the whole story or the perspective. So you're not getting that from just a press release that's written by a company for their generally investors. And so I think we have to be careful. Anybody want to add to this? Just wondering if anybody had any thoughts on this, just to Gethin?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's important that the whole community sort of works together on this as well. And I think sometimes other news organizations can pick up these press releases and go with them. And perhaps that amplifies the hope or the false hope. And I think it's important that we all say, okay, if you're going to talk about a study, you talk about it very realistically, and we all have equal responsibility to that as a community representative. I think it's so. There's no one organisation should run with this. Everyone should help.
Yeah. Good. Thank you, Gethin. Jincy?
I'll just add that the communication, there's differences in the types of communications you'll see, right? So a press release from a company is intended to face the investor community, and it fulfills their what they call fiduciary responsibility. Essentially, they're developing a drug for ALS. There's a high unmet need. They need to make sure they move a drug forward, and their responsibility ethically is to find the funding so that they can responsibly conduct a clinical trial. Scientific communications in journals and in scientific meetings are peer reviewed and have a little more vetting. So when you see announcements from meetings that announce new science, they've been peer reviewed by other scientists. So they'll have a different tone and and I think sometimes it can get hard because the press releases get picked up by media. So the other aspect, as chair of the Clinical Trial Consortium, I've worked very hard with kind of connecting with media to tell them. And so just last week, I met with a whole bunch. I had a roundtable just to tell them that they have to be responsible when press releases come out, because a basic science experiment gets released as a press release, and then all of a sudden the Associated Press will pick up that announcement, announce like there's a cure for ALS, and that goes all over social media, and then it raises the kind of misinformation and this kind of false hope that Nadia was talking about. So having them understand and vet their information from press releases is very important. So it's not just about the sponsors doing responsible work, but also all the people that touch that communication. And so I think that's one. And for us, ourselves, as people living with ALS or caring for people with ALS or people in the field, really understanding the differences of the types of communications that come out of every phase of clinical trials. So it should be understood that press releases carry a different purpose than webinars like this from a organization that's vetted in science, scientific meetings, international alliance meetings. So these are different, and I think that can help kind of sort out the information.
Yeah. Thank you, Jinsey. And Notina, I want to come oh, sorry, Piera, go ahead.
No, sorry. I think if I can add to what Nadia and Jinsey said, it's very important that we function with webinars like this, but also on our day-to-day life, in our interaction with the ALS community, with people living with ALS and their caregiver, that we really continue the education process and continue to decode and translate, actually.
Yeah.
All these press releases, right? And also decode and translate these scientific publications. Because even in the scientific publication, there can be more hope and hype because, of course, the way we write our abstract is always this can be the next real therapeutic target. This can really be the next biomarker, etc., which is true, is based on scientific fact, but in order to then have the effective drug, it takes a long time. So I think that is very important that all of us do our job, and education is one of the fundamental part. I've always believed, having lived actually with a mom who was in the wheelchair and had a neurological chronic disease for many, many years, an educated patient is a happier patient, even though they know that they cannot really benefit. There is not the effective therapy yet. But I think it's very important to make them understand, and part of why there is not an effective therapy, and what are the challenges, and what each trial tells us about these challenges. The trial is an information. The research gives us one piece of the information, and how we as Nadia said, how we interpret that information is crucial.
Yeah. Pierre, I think what you said earlier is really important. A clinical trial is an experiment. It's a scientific experiment, and I think it should be viewed as that, and the results should be viewed in that perspective. Notina, I would like to come to you because, we're talking about hope versus hype and, kind of the drugs that are in the pipeline that are going through, phase 1, phase 2. But there are a lot of alternative treatments that, have not gone through that pipeline, but sometimes do get, a lot of hype. The vitamins, the CoQ10. So, how do you view that? And, is that, obviously we want people to, be healthy and stay healthy. But, there's this narrative of you take a particular vitamin and, you can cure ALS or that would be a good treatment. So how are you viewing that? And how do you view that in sort of the perspective from where you are in Malaysia?
Yeah, thanks very much for that. So I think it's really interesting because I think out of everybody who is on this panel, I can certainly share that hope versus hype is incredibly difficult to address. When the level of awareness is not great, there are also different cultural perspectives, beliefs. So it is so you have different groups of patients, the ones who are educated will be looking and, will come to me and says, oh, I've heard there's this new discovery, and it'll be something that's probably on the Healy platform. And I have to sit there and says, yeah, we don't really have access to any of the clinical trials. You're lucky if you even have Riluzole because that is also being paid out of pocket as well, which means that majority of patients don't have that access. And then you've got another group of patients where they're maybe not as well versed about what ALS is. And then suddenly they come to you and then you tell them that actually, you've got this disease which they've never heard of, and that there isn't a cure. So then, of course, if you don't have anything on offer, I mean, as a clinician, I can completely empathize that people will look for other ways. And when you are in countries where it's maybe not as regulated in terms of, the access, the treatments, and you're seeing, people doing from, like more religious-based stuff. So Malaysia, for instance, we're a multiracial country. So they might go to a religious leader, or they might go to Ayurvedic, or they might go to traditional Chinese medicine. So these are all the sort of alternative therapy that is out there on top of, individuals taking multiple different types of vitamins. And I had, after the Prime C came out, obviously those are two, antimicrobials, and they'll come to me and say, could you not just give us those two drugs? And like I would do, I don't know where I stand on that. I mean, obviously, where I'm based without clear evidence, it's not something that I could deliver, certainly not in my institution. But you can certainly see where they're coming from, because we don't have access to the trials. But some of these treatments could be available anyway in isolation. So that's the sort of things that we're seeing in the majority parts of the world, globally. If you go to Africa, you might see that they go to some spiritual health, sort of like healer, or they might think that this was a curse, etc. So that's the sort of thing that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
But I wanted to also put a positive slant to this, because I do have patients coming to me talking about what Richard Bedlag is doing, which is the ALS reversals, right?
Yeah.
So, and there's some merit to that. So sometimes with the patient, I will tell them, I say, look, I'm here to support you. I don't have a cure. And if you want to try these, I'll give you the evidence. I will give you what the scientific backup is. I will advise you about the fact that there are lots of businesses out there that's doing stem cell therapy. Some of it is a little bit weird, how they're delivering the stem cell. But at the same time, they do feel like they're doing better. And I think there is some merit in maybe doing, the N=1 or whatever it is that you're looking. If you're seeing that patients are having some reversal of their symptoms, maybe whatever concoction that they're doing, there is some merit. So I don't want to kind of like pour hot, kind of cold water over these sort of things, especially in countries where there is limited access to drugs that are, that typically found in high-income countries. Then I think that maybe what we can do is see what is available in those settings, alternative as they are. So for instance, I mean, acupuncture in the context of spasticity and pain, there is some evidence for that. So if my patients feel better after doing acupuncture, there is no harm to that. Then why not? Yes, that's my perspective anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, and Notina, I think you mentioned Dr. Rick Bedlack. I put in a website for ALS Untangled.
The ALS Untangled. Yeah.
I think just for people who are listening in, if you want to know, Dr. Bedlack and his team does a really good job looking at these alternative treatments and what evidence there is for that treatment, and they provide a grade, sort of A, B, C, D, and they provide evidence, preclinical, as Piera said, and clinical on, whether that alternative treatment has been done in ALS, what's the experience like, what the results are showing, and so on. So it's a really good resource for anybody looking into these. So thank you, Notina. Jinsey, I saw you go off mute. You had something to add.
Yeah, I was just going to say one last thing, because it's true that I also take the same approach as Dr. Sharazala. I essentially talk about the risks and benefits, but I will say there's a perception that the supplements and nutraceuticals or alternative therapies have less risks. And something simple like a supplement that you might purchase on your own or through online resources could have side effects. And I just had an example of somebody taking large doses of vitamin E, and they were very healthy. They're a physician, a doctor, and they just took a simple fall and they had a massive subdural hematoma, bleeding in the brain. And it was thought to be related to the elevated vitamin E. And so it's really important to talk about it with your healthcare provider or anyone who's providing you care in a clinic.
Yeah, and I think, Jesse, that's a really good point. I know that people sometimes get these supplements or treatments from, Amazon or some, and you have no idea what you're getting in that case. I think, as Nortina said, and you said, talk to your doctor and get, if you are going to be on a supplement, get it from a resource that you can trust, that the doctor trusts, and not, something that you're getting off, you know, an internet order because you're not sure what you're getting.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say is Dr. Bedlack did publish an alternative therapies article in Annals of Neurology, and it covers like when you're taking supplements to try to think about the scientific rationale. ALS Untangled is a good source, and sometimes I talk about people trying to hit all the mechanisms that they're reportedly supposed to target, so you don't have so many duplications of therapies.
Right. I just had one question. One of the questions that had come in was pre-submitted, and this I don't think we have time kind of go into very deeply into this, but sort of what is our current consensus, on using neurofilament light as a reliable fluid biomarker to monitor the disease. So looking at progression. Um, I don't know who wants to go first, Pierre or Gethin. You haven't spoken in a while. What do you think about using NFL as a way to monitor the ongoing disease? I mean, the issue, Pierre, I see is that, the availability of the assays that measure neurofilament light may be an issue in certain parts of the world. And so, how do you integrate that into, the sort of every 3 months, if a person with ALS is going and seeing a doctor, how do you integrate NFL measurements in progression?
It is, I mean, that perhaps is a better question for any of the physicians here, but from the preclinical and the evidence that neurofilament I'm a fan of neurofilament. I understand all the challenges that we still have. It is very variable patient to patient. It is not it is a marker of neurodegeneration, but it is not a marker of ALS specifically, right? Having said that, I think it is a solid marker that, contrary to what we believe, has even been identified 30 years ago in the mouse model of ALS as increasing as disease progressed, starting at onset, right? And so it is a marker of neurodegeneration. We know that ALS progression is driven by neurodegeneration. So I think that, and so far is what we have, right?
Yeah.
And therefore, I think oftentimes, as we continue to improve the standardization of the test that we use to monitor neurofilament, as we understand that perhaps different group of patients may have different levels of neurofilament, some are even below the threshold. There was a publication showing that TDP43 patients with mutations may not really have high level of neurofilament that are really detectable, and it comes later in disease. So as we understand all these things, as we standardized all these things, I think that oftentimes the perfection is the enemy of the good. And right now, I think that we should really look at neurofilament as something that we have right now.
Yeah.
And we can use how to bring it into the standardization of the test, how to bring it globally. I think maybe that's a question for Nortina and for Jinzi, how the clinicians really can start standardizing this and using it as yet another marker of, together with the LSFRSR, together with FVC, with breathing, just to as another marker of disease, objective marker of disease progression.
Yeah. Notina, maybe take a minute on this because we're getting short on time. So I also want to go to Nadia for one more thing. Notina?
Oh, as in terms of using the biomarkers. So
To
at the
look
moment,
at progression of the disease.
yeah, I mean, essentially is basically in terms of resource. So I think for now, I mean, Gethin alluded to the fact that we're having collaboration. One of it is the seed, which is coming out soon, which is for underrepresented settings. So at the very least, the standards, I think using the technology of Simoa is not something that's accessible for a lot of people, but at the very least, you can biobank and maybe work with, organizations like Target ALS or other kind of like hub and spoke where you can standardize it. But in a local setting, finding ways of biobanking at the very least until there is funding to put that through, some sort of platform would be how I would suggest we move forward in underrepresented settings anyway.
Yeah, thank you, Notina. Oh, Jinsey, go ahead. 30
Just
seconds.
one sentence. Neurofilament is not diagnostic for ALS, so it's not specific to ALS. So it creates a lot of anxiety in people who actually have ALS and who don't have ALS. So just remember, we're still working as a community to try to figure out how to use it in the clinical setting.
Yeah, and I think, Jinsey, that's the consensus, which is I think we are trying to get there, right? Is this going to be a diagnostic marker? Is it going to be a progression marker? Is it going to be a drug treatment response marker? And that I think is what the current pipeline will sort out. Gethin, I want to come to you because Notina mentioned the seed grant, and I just want to make sure that people understand what that is. If you could just describe it in 2 minutes.
Yeah, very briefly. It's an initiative coming out through the collaboration between FightMND, ALS Canada, and the Alliance to actually offer some funding for underrepresented regions to build up their research capability, to start building research frameworks and that capacity to be able to either collect samples to prepare for clinical trials, to really allow these regions to start participating in larger scale studies. So that grant is going to be, it's a grant process, up to $50,000 per grant. And it comes out on the 21st of June on the Alliance website, and that will be open to any, I think we're classing it as low and middle income countries around the world. And we encourage everyone to apply. And we're really looking forward to seeing what opportunities are out there. And ideally, going on the collaboration theme, it should, hopefully we'll have groups of researchers in different countries and regions working together to build research active networks. Could be very exciting. We're really keen to see how it comes out.
Yeah, thank you, Gethin. And Nadia, maybe the last question is for you. And last 5 minutes we have, how I think we all talked about different kinds of observational studies. We talked about clinical trials and interventional studies, but Jinsey mentioned natural history studies, and one of the groups that is sometimes overlooked are slow progressors, and sort of. They may have had ALS for many years. It's a very slow progressing disease, which, is a good thing as well. Compared to, it being very, very fast progressing. However, given who is recruited into the trials and into the studies, sometimes slow progressors may not get those opportunities. And Nadia, what is your thinking around how slow progressors can get involved in studies if they're not able to be eligible for clinical trials? there are opportunities outside of that where it would be really valuable to study slow progressive. So just I know it's not fair to have you introduce this in the last 5 minutes, but any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think there are many slow progressors out there who are wondering how they can be involved in research. And I've been having this conversation with people for years. I think this year at North Star during ALS Awareness Month here in the US, we did a post on slow progression, and it just got this huge, massive response from so many people saying, yeah, I wish scientists would study me. I think one of the challenges is that scientists cannot really come find you, and people do need to find studies that they can be involved in. So these natural history studies are a great way to be involved. Yes, you are of a lot of interest to the scientific community. You are a lot of interest to other people who are living with ALS. We all want to know why somebody is progressing slowly. And without having those large data sets to really understand what makes slow progressors different, we won't be able we need that data to develop that understanding, right? Piera talked a lot about different techniques that we have available now. We have AI, we have big data sets, we have omics. And so understanding why somebody is progressing slowly is going to be a critical piece in developing therapeutics potentially and all of that. And that really means seeking out those natural history studies and observational studies and getting involved. Beyond that, there's other ways for slow progressors to get involved. We have, BCI research now that's happening around the world. And BCI may not be a cure, but it is supportive technology that can really help people communicate, especially in more advanced stages of the disease. We've got, we talked a little bit about supplements and things like that. And so there's lots of things that people can do if it's their desire to in a safe way under their doctor's supervision. But yeah, natural history studies are really key that's the research that makes all of the other research go faster. It's the research that will lead us to new drug targets. It's the research that tells us about people who are living with the disease so we can understand the biology better, so that we can identify better therapeutics, all of those things. So it's about seeking out those natural history studies and really getting involved. Here in the US, we talked a little bit about All ALS. Gethin mentioned, Project Mine. There's lots of large data sets that are available. We're also seeing data sets outside of ALS globally. We have massive studies in the general population that are going on. We see a lot of studies coming out of the UK Biobank, right? But having the slow progression studied at a closer level will really require larger data sets from people living with ALS who are contributing.
Yeah, I always like to say, Nadia, that if we can do genomics in slow progressors versus fast progressors and figure out what genes are activated or not in slow progressors, we essentially want all fast progressors to be slow progressors, right? I mean that we could use those biology or those targets. So I agree. I think it's really important. And Jinsi, I saw that you answered the question on NUZ001, so that's great. I thank you for doing that. Well, with that, I think this was really an amazing panel. We covered a huge ground in the 60 minutes. And so I want to thank Piera and Gethin and Otina and Nadia and Jinsi for joining this panel. Your thoughts, your perspectives. I wish we had more time. We could speak for another hour or two. But I really hope that the community continues to lean into the Alliance and tune in to these updates. We do these 2 times in a year. And we'll do another one in December during the Alliance meeting. And with that, I would like to pitch it back to Jessica from the Alliance as she will wrap this up. Jessica?
There I am. Hi. So thank you, Coldip. So I just want to echo the thank you you just said to all of you. Thank you, Coldip, for an amazing moderation and facilitating this conversation. To the panel and the Scientific Advisory Council, we are so grateful for the time and work you put throughout the year, providing us with information and educating us on what is happening in research. And also a thank you to everyone who has joined us today or who's watching the recording. We appreciate your time and joining us. And I wish you everyone, wherever you are in the world, a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.